The Road Not Taken. Johannes Althusius. Part 1. Consociation. According to Carl Joachim Friedrich, one-time Eton professor of the science of government at Harvard University and professor of political science at the University of Heidelberg, a certain man was, he says, the most profound political philosopher between Baudin and Hobbes. Who was Friedrich talking about? He was talking about Johannes Althusius. Who, you might ask? Well, some thinkers are deservedly little known, some are undeservedly well known. I've got a little list. And some are undeservedly little known. Johannes Althusius belongs to this latter class. Althusius was born in the middle of the 16th century, by which time the part of Germany in which he lived, Diedenhausen in Westphalia, was already a stronghold of Calvinism. He studied law, logic and philosophy in various places, including Basel and Cologne, before returning to his home area to teach law. At around the age of 40, he became a municipal trustee of the city of Emden in the very north of Germany, close to the Dutch border, and rose through the city's ranks to become syndic, a senior administrator, which post he held for over 30 years until he died in 1638. It can be seen from this brief biographical resume that Althusius managed to combine both theoretical knowledge and practical experience of politics, and his reflections were no mere idle speculations, but were given a sharp practical point by the Dutch Calvinist revolt against Catholic Spain, which took place during Althusius's early and middle years. Althusius' ideas were, to a certain extent, in competition with those of Jean Baudin. Daniel Elazar notes, and I believe he is correct in this, that the Althusian view lost out to the Baudinian view of reified centralized states where all powers were lodged in a divinely ordained king at the top of the power pyramid, or in the sovereign center. Althusius adopts the concept of sovereignty from Baudin, but he locates it differently. For Althusius, sovereignty is to be located in the people, taken corporately, not in the ruler or rector or administrator. This sovereignty is not only not alienated to any ruler, it is in fact inalienable. Power, yes, is given to the ruler to administer the affairs of the commonwealth, but sovereignty, however, remains with the people as a whole. With the triumph of the modern state based on a Baudinian conception of sovereignty, Althusius' ideas were swept to one side and forgotten, until the end of the 19th century, when Otto Guericke drew attention to them once again. As George Sabine notes, Althusius' theory had little application in France and England, where the political thinking of the 16th and 17th centuries mainly took place. This fact was perhaps one of the reasons why Althusius' work fell into oblivion. In the 1930s, Althusius' reputation was given another fillip by the work of Carl Joachim Friedrich, who republished the major part of Althusius' principal work, Politica Methodice Digesta, Aeque Exempli Sacris, et Profanis Illustrata. Over the years, a small but growing band of scholars have dedicated themselves to re-establishing Althusius' reputation as a thinker whose ideas are worthy of rehabilitation. Only at the end of the first century of the Reformation, writes Daniel Elazar, did the political philosopher emerge out of the Reformed tradition to build a systematic political philosophy out of the Reformed experience by synthesizing the political experience of the Holy Roman Empire with the political ideas of the covenant theology of Reformed Protestantism. As unusual and even startling as Althusius' theory might appear to be, it is in fact, in many ways, simply a theoretical tidying up of the de facto arrangements that subsisted in the Holy Roman Empire. Although Althusius is a transitional figure between medieval and modern times, he is remarkably inclusive in his choice of sources. He has Aristotle, Baudin of course, Cicero, Augustine and Seneca. All these feature in his writings, as one might expect. As a Calvinist, Althusius was also acquainted, of course, with the Vindiciae contra Tyrannus and the writings of George Buchanan and the French anti-monarchists. Althusius also has an extensive interest in and ecumenical appreciation of some Catholic writers, notably the late Spanish scholastics, Velázquez, Covarrubias, and Mariana. It should be noted that not everyone, however, is as persuaded of Althusius's eminent stature as Friedrich and Goethe. Stephen Gravel notes that Erik Voegelin stands alone among 20th century political philosophers and intellectual historians with his unilaterally negative assessment of Althusius for his use of the Ramus method. Voegelin writes, Althusius's work is still overrated as a consequence of Otto Guericke's monograph. The Politica is by far the most solid work of the Calvinist monarchomachic group. It is the work of an experienced practical lawyer who could digest his rich knowledge with the aid of his method into a well-ordered book, but it is definitely not the work of a great political thinker. It's often held that Althusius's work is one of the first federalist theories of political order based on the concept of subsidiarity. Daniel Elazar, however, believes that Althusius found a model for his federal design in the Old Testament. Biblical thought is federal from the Latin Fides covenant, from first to last, writes Elazar. Early federalism was tribal or corporatist, or, as I would say, status-based. Modern federalism tended to emphasize the individual to the detriment of the group. The Althusian model is an attempt to combine the strengths and to eliminate the weaknesses of the other two models. A postmodern federalism must recognize both individuals and their rights, and also groups. It must be based on covenant. Sovereignty must remain with the people as a whole, and there must be some recognition, minimal, of norms binding citizens and providing a basis for trust and communication. The public and private realms must be distinguished yet connected. Dunning sees Althusius as having a conception of the people that is actually incompatible with any conception of the state, except one that is confederative. Was Althusius, in fact, a federalist? M. or Ozavarda thinks not. He writes, Althusius is neither a scholastic subsidiarity thinker nor the first federalist, or one of the founding fathers of the liberal constitutional state. According to Ozavarda, Althusius structures his political theory on what Ozavarda calls sphere sovereignty, which is independent both of the Bodinian notion of sovereignty and the scholastic notion of subsidiarity. The rights and duties of any given sphere are peculiar to that sphere, so that Althusius' state has no responsibility for the provision of subsidiary assistance to lower authorities in order to make citizens flourish or guard the common good. The only responsibility of the state is to administer justice by maintaining law and order in the universal, symbiotic association of all spheres in a fight against parasitism. In the end, whether federalist or not, whether great and profound or merely workmanlike, what cannot be denied is that Althusius' thought stands out from among the mass of political writings of this period, particularly in its opposition to the increasingly dominant Bodinian conception of sovereignty in respect of its ultimate location. Elazar remarks, to read Althusius is to discover how important his ideas are for our times, eclipsed for 3 centuries by the major thrust of the modern epoch towards the homogeneous nation-state built around the individual citizen, standing politically naked before the state machinery. Althusian ideas seem much more in place in the postmodern epoch. Althusius' starting point is this. Politics is the art of associating men for the purpose of establishing, cultivating, and conserving social life among them. Whence, it is called symbiotics. For Althusius, symbiotic association is not just a happenstance fact of living in proximity to other people, it indicates a quality of group life characterized by piety and justice, without which, Althusius believes, neither individual persons nor society can endure. The subject matter of politics is therefore association, in which the symbiotes pledge themselves each to the other by explicit or tacit agreement to mutual communication of whatever is useful and necessary for the harmonious exercise of social life. The word which Carney translates as associating is consociandi, for which I'm going to use the neologism consociation, as association for Althusius has the ring of the involuntary, while what he wants to emphasize is the voluntary coming together of men on various levels. Despite the very many references to scripture in Althusius's work and his conventional identification of natural law with the second table of the Decalogue, his political theory depends in no essential way on any religious assumptions. Althusius' political theory depended logically upon the single idea of contract and owed substantially nothing to religious authority, so writes Sabine. Althusius notes the truism that the individual man is radically insufficient even for his own self-preservation, let alone his flourishing, and that this insufficiency is what moves him towards consociating with others. Necessity therefore induces association, consociandi, and the want of things necessary for life, which are acquired and communicated by the help and aid of one's associates, consociates, conserves it. For this reason, it is evident that the commonwealth, or civil society, exists by nature, and that man is by nature a civil animal who strives eagerly for association, or consociation. Now this voluntary coming together of man, this consociation, is, for Althusius, the subject matter of politics. In consociating, those who live together, whom Althusius calls symbiotes, pledge themselves to each other by explicit or tacit agreement to mutual communication, making common sharing of whatever is useful and necessary for the harmonious exercise of social life. But this communication has three aspects. A communication of things, which relates to the production of useful and necessary goods for the common advantage of the symbiotes, both individually and collectively. A communication of services, which relates to contributions the symbiotes make to their social life by means of their work and occupations. And a communication of rights, which is the means by which the symbiotes are ruled by just laws in the life together. This third aspect of communication, the communication of rights, is the one that is of most interest to political philosophers. Althusius typically divides this communication of right, which he also calls the law of consociation, into two parts, one common and one proper. The common part of this law of consociation concerns itself with the highest level of political organization, which supervenes upon every other constituent part, what we would normally think of as the state, while the proper part relates to the laws by which particular forms of consociation are to be governed. Althusius sees human society as constituted by an ascending order of consociations, with the family at the lowest and most particular level, and the realm of the commonwealth at the highest and most universal. Between the family and the commonwealth are the collegium, the city, and the province. The common part of the law of consociation then belongs to the realm or commonwealth, which is the overarching form of consociation, and the proper part to the family, the collegium, the city, and the province. Each of these forms of consociation has the same structure, which Althusius explains using the Aristotelian doctrine of the four causes: efficient, formal, material, and final. The efficient cause of a consociation, what brings it into being, is the consent and agreement of the communicants. The formal cause, what the consociation is when it is brought into being, is the institution, cultivation, maintenance, and conservation of the fellowship of the communicants by the making of decisions on what is useful and necessary for life in common. The material cause of consociation is, according to Althusius, the aggregate of precepts for communicating the things, services, and rights needed for the common advantages of social life. And the final cause, what all of this is for, and that towards which it is directed, is the enjoyment of a comfortably useful and happy life, and of the common welfare, and the production of a society in which one can worship God quietly and without error. Each consociation is constituted by an agreement which has a horizontal and a vertical dimension. These dimensions result from an agreement or contract that sets out the rules according to which that consociation is to be organized, which rules include the vertical, that is to say, administrative machinery for the effective implementation of those rules. The horizontal dimension makes the consociation to be the kind of consociation it is. The vertical dimension creates and limits an authority for administering its common affairs. These 5 types of consociation are vertically related to one another. The family at the bottom, the realm or commonwealth at the top. Each consociation higher in the scale than the one or ones below it, it regulates such affairs as are essential to its purposes, leaving all other affairs within the remit of the consociations lower in the scale. Although Althusius makes contract or covenant to be the efficient cause of all his consociations, this contract or covenant can be either explicit or implicit. As implicit, this seems to amount to pretty much the innate social tendency that many writers have remarked upon. Althusius's grand design is developed out of a series of building blocks or self-governing cells from the smallest, most intimate connections to the universal commonwealth, each of which is internally organized and linked to the others by some form of consensual relationship. So writes Elazar. The basis of each consociation is covenant, requiring initial and continuing consent from its constituents. Some forms of consociation, such as the family, are less explicitly voluntary than others, such as the collegia, but all depend to some extent on needs that the consociations are intended to satisfy. This integral relationship between necessity and volition that first finds expression in private associations carries over into public associations and becomes one of the distinctive characteristics of the entire associational theory of Althusius. All forms of consociation, from the family to the commonwealth, are grounded upon symbiosis and covenant, so that there is no essential difference in kind between them. Some things to note about this causal account. Well, first, and most importantly, every form of consociation is voluntary, requiring either explicit or tacit consent. Second, as often happens, the formal and final causes tend to coalesce. That is to say, what a consociation is and what it is for are scarcely distinguishable. Third, Althusius's material cause is strangely immaterial. One might have expected him to describe this as being made up of the things, services, and rights needed for the common advantage. Instead, he describes it as the aggregate of precepts relating to those things. Althusius believes that each form of consociation requires imperium. Once constituted as the kind of consociation it is, each consociation requires an administration that can give effective leadership and direction so that it may achieve its purposes. Before discussing what is of most concern to us, namely the universal form of consociation, the realm or commonwealth, I am going to give a brief account of the less universal forms of consociation, the family and the collegium, which are simple and private forms of consociation, and the city and province, which together with the commonwealth are mixed and public. Of the two simple and private forms of consociation, the family and the collegium, the family is natural and the collegium is civil. The family for Althusius is the primary form of consociation, without which no other form of consociation could come to be or to endure. All other forms of consociation are derivative from the family. The family, he says, is rightly called the most intense society, friendship, relationship, and union, the seedbed of every other symbiotic consociation. By family, Althusius means more than the unity of father, mother, and offspring. His family includes not only the married parties, but also blood relatives and in-laws. Nevertheless, he distinguishes within the general family form of consociation between the conjugal type, husband, wife, and children, and the kinship type, relatives and in-laws. Family is brought into being by means of a covenant among individuals in which married persons, blood relatives, and in-laws, in response to a natural affection and necessity, agree to a definite communication among themselves. Its purpose or end is the communication of each to the other of aid and assistance, station in life, economic condition, solicitude, food, clothing, cohabitation, sexual congress, and procreation, education of children, and so on. Within the larger family, the kin, we can add solicitude for one's relatives and the provision of support in cases of necessity. The husband is the director and governor of the common affairs of the conjugal unit. Within the larger kinship group, the paterfamilias assumes leadership. As always with enthusiasts, and as we shall see very clearly when we come to discuss the Commonwealth, leadership is a service which one renders for the good of others, and not a status to be had for one's own gratification or aggrandizement. The second form of the simple and private form of consociation is the collegium, by which enthusiast means such voluntary groupings as guilds, corporations, societies, federations, sodalities, conventions, or synods. There are collegia of bakers, tailors, builders, merchants, coiners of money, philosophers, theologians, government officials, craftsmen and merchants, and others. Some collegia stand alone. Others are themselves constituent parts of yet larger collegia. Such consociations are constituted by the voluntary agreement of individuals to unite for purposes related to their duties or their crafts. In his account of the functioning of the collegium, we are given the first hint of enthusiasts' approach to the broader issues of governance. Each collegium will choose one of its members as president to administer the property and functions proper to the collegium. As president, he is superior to each of the individuals in the collegium, but not to the collegium itself. His role is one of service to the group, that is, the purpose for which he is elected. In its relationships to others, the collegium forms a unity such that what is owed to it is owed not to the individuals who constitute it, but to the collegium as a whole. In turn, what it owes is not owed by the individuals constituting the collegium, but by the collegium as a whole. Althusius gives a detailed account of the inner workings of the collegium that needn't concern us here. Suffice it to say that in matters that pertain jointly and wholly to the collegium, the decision of the majority binds all. However, in matters that bear upon each member individually, majority will not suffice. Here, unanimity is required.